It's my pleasure to welcome so many people to this In Conversation event hosted by York St John University in celebration of LGBT History Month. I'm Dr. Esther McIntosh. I'm the Associate Head of the School of Humanities for Religion, Politics and International Relations. And I'm delighted to be in conversation tonight with Jamie Windust. Jamie is a fashion icon and non-binary trailblazer. They are a multi-talented writer, speaker and model. They have written for The Independent, Gay Times, British GQ, Cosmopolitan, Into More, amongst other places. They are editor and founder of the award-winning Fruitcake magazine, a speaker and presenter for TEDx London Women, and author of In Their Shoes, Navigating Non-Binary Life. And I'll just hold this up here.
Wow, isn't that good?
This is Jamie's beautiful book. It's Jamie's personal story of exploration and discrimination. It's an energetic read, peppered with humorous anecdotes and advice for other non-binary people. And if you haven't had a chance to read the book yet, Fox Lane Books are selling signed copies as part of tonight's event. And there's a URL in the chat for you to be able to link to Fox Lane Books. So, Jamie, when did you decide to write the book?
Great question. Thank you very much for having me, by the way. Hello to everyone. Thank you for joining. The book's, I guess, conception came around a period of time where I just left university and I'd been writing for a long time, but a lot of that was unpublished. And during my final year of university, I realized that I wanted to get into freelance and into the media world. And I knew that I wasn't going to be able to do that straight away just by leaving university and beginning then. I knew I had to make small inroads whilst I was in my final year. So I started writing personally and then pitching out to just anyone who wanted me, to be honest. I was just a bit of an email pest for my final year. And all of that hard work basically meant that I had a few commissions under my belt, a few pitches out into the world, like you said, for people like The Independent and Gay Times. And I was approached by my wonderful publishers, Jessica Kingsley, with this idea, essentially. Now, the idea for this book started as a children's book initially. And I said, I don't like children. I'd like to know. I was like, I don't think my writing style would work for children, because I'm too I'm too blunt, or I'm just quite real, and in quite a backwards way to how the literary world works, we formulated the concept for what In Their Shoes became together. What would normally happen is either I would come to them with this idea, or I would pitch this idea to lots of different publishers, but we almost kind of created it together. Yeah, and that's kind of how it came about, which I was really happy with, to be honest. It was really nice kind of easing me into the literary industry in that way, because it's quite a tough industry to get into.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's great. And so in the book, you talk through various aspects of your own journey. So I'll ask you some questions about some of those now. So, for example, you talk about your frustration when you were around the age of 14, 15, and you had that sense of not being able to dress up the way you wanted to dress. You couldn't wear a ball gown to family meals, for example. And you say that you craved feminine elegance. And you were particularly attracted to 80s fashion. So what was it about the 80s in particular that was so appealing to you?
I think, for me, the 80s, in my opinion, is one of the first times that I saw, or I resonated with the very clear way in which fashion was used as a tool for social expression. Like women, people always joke about the shoulder pads, but women in suits, women in shoulder pads was indicative of them moving into more traditionally masculine roles. Like there was a reason behind a lot of the fashion choices from the 80s, the punk movement, that kind of is linked with music. Like there was always a real reason behind what people were doing, and they had something to say with what they were wearing and how they chose to present themselves. And I just really resonated with that. And also just on an aesthetic level, at that point in time, I loved anything colorful. I loved anything ridiculous. I loved anything borderline ugly. So I think that that encapsulates the 80s quite nicely, I'll say.
Absolutely, it definitely seems like, yeah, someone who was sort of growing up in the 80s at the time, that, you know, what was referred to as gender bending was definitely, you know, a really key part of that 80s fashion. You know, started seeing more men in makeup, that sort of thing, new romantics, right. Yeah, all of that, great era in that sense. So, and then your first job was in a department store. So tell us about your journey across the floor from the menswear to the beauty counters where you really wanted to be.
Yes, way back when. Yeah, that was kind of a really interesting time, because my exploration with fashion and makeup was happening at the same time that I was having these feelings about gender, but I didn't know until I was a lot older that, you know, these two things were linked. There was a reason why that was happening. And my exploration with makeup really came about when I was in this department store, because you know, looking at it now, it's quite almost ironic how I was banished to the menswear section and told I have to work here, and that's what my position was, and I wanted to move over into the makeup counters, which I saw as almost like quite a haven of glamour. And you know, I was told no. I was told, you know, you're not in London, you're not in Selfridges, you can't do this. Like, I was back in Dorset, where I'm from, so it was, you know, I was basically told I wasn't allowed. And then when I was allowed, finally, after pestering, it was lovely and I enjoyed it. But the reaction from customers and staff was just like, I never expected it, because all I wanted to do was to have fun and enjoy what I was doing. I didn't even really think about what other people could think about it. And that for me was one of my first, I guess, instances of noticeable reactions to the way I looked as prejudice, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm sure we'll come back to more of that shortly, the way that other people react. And then you continued with your fashion journey, if you like, at university. And you do have a first-class honours degree in fashion management and marketing. And as part of your degree, you worked in fashion PR. And we imagine that fashion is this world where people are free to express themselves, but it didn't quite turn out like that, did it?
Yeah, I mean, if anyone's watching who is studying creatively or has done any form of internship in the creative industries, I'd say 99% of the time it's not as what you would expect. There is an element to it that is like what you see in the media or what you see in films, that kind of incredibly energized environment. It's incredibly fast paced, and that is all true. But yeah, I just found the fashion industry in that respect very limiting. It was still very traditional, even though looking outwardly at it and looking at the representation that might occur, or looking at campaigns and that type of thing, brands may appear and fashion houses may appear inclusive or liberal. Behind the scenes, that is really not the case. The people running the machine are unfortunately not as always as aware as you would like. And that was kind of my real moment. That was at the end of my second year, where I realized, okay, I don't necessarily want to just work in fashion. I want to do something bigger. And that's where I started the idea for myself to work in the media.
Okay, so yeah, tell us a bit more about that. So while you were at university, you also interned for Stonewall, and you created the award-winning fruitcake. So tell us a bit more about those more positive experiences at Stonewall, and about how you created fruitcake.
Yeah, so when I was interning in fashion, I basically realized that I couldn't do this anymore. I was like, I can't. I'm quite a stubborn person, but if I know something, if I'm doing something and I know that I don't want to do it, and I'm not going to let lots of people down, I will try and change that. So halfway through my internship, I saw there was an opening at Stonewall for a media intern, managed to get that position, which was really fortunate to have and to get, and finished the last 6 weeks of my internship there. And that was really wonderful, to be honest, because it was the first work environment that I've been into that was completely LGBT friendly. It was queer friendly. There was just a real safety in that space. And it then inspired me to head into my final year, where I was asked to just create a business. So it was any business I wanted. Everyone kind of went down the fashion route because it was a fashion business course. And I was like, do you know what? After my time at Stonewall, I'm going to use this energy and try and create something different. And that's where Fruitcake was born. And yeah, it did quite well. It did all right, actually. It
did very well. Yeah, so then you've continued on then from Fruitcake with developing your own sort of portfolio career, as it were, as it tends to be termed these days. And so you give this description in your book of finishing your degree, and I think most students feel exactly what you were saying in that book just now. And you state, there's not really any way to finish university without feeling like you're literally the only person in the world who doesn't have a job and you're falling off a cliff. And I think it's especially now with the COVID pandemic, I think our graduating students are feeling exactly this. So you're now working freelance, and as I said, you have this portfolio career. So how have you made that work for you?
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of the kind of collective environment when we left university, I graduated nearly 3 years ago, was just that. It was like, goodness me, you know, we're really just going into the world, because I think it's quite easy to forget that for a lot of, you know, not all students, but for a lot of students, we have just gone from education to education to education for our whole lives at that point. And this is our first step into the unknown and autonomy. And I think that's why my biggest piece of advice for students who are either near graduation or heading into will be heading into their final year is to, no matter what you want to do, to start getting examples of that work, getting experience in that work during your final year. It's obviously easier said than done, depending on your course, but it really helped me to then go into my portfolio career because I had some form of direction. I had some form of example to give people. And that foundation that I lay for myself, that really just constantly comes in handy. Like, I still relate back to my degree when I'm working with brands. I do a lot more consultancy now. So I work with brands kind of one-on-one to help them with pride campaigns, help them reach LGBT audiences, that kind of thing. And then with writing, kind of the book and my continued kind of just freelance work then led me to, in June of last year, be appointed contributing editor at Gay Times, which is like a nice natural progression. And I think it's quite easy in freelance careers to feel like you don't necessarily have progression, or it can feel quite stunted sometimes. Like, am I just going to do this forever? But that all of that work came from, like I say, that foundation of having something to kickstart me out straight out of university. Because, you know, in the creative industries, 1 in 2 people work freelance, so it's quite a common thing. So yeah, that's the advice I'd give.
Brilliant. And so you've had to put yourself out there as a visible non-binary person, and you know that's part of your developing this portfolio career. It's also encouraging and inspirational for other non-binary people to see you out there, but being visible isn't always a positive experience, is it?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that for me, representation is almost like a double-edged sword. Or public, not just of me, but just of any marginalized group. Like, it comes with lots of difficulty, I think, because, and I've only really reflected on this in the past 6 months, but the first 18 months of my working life out of university was solely focused on me getting work that was based off of my identity. So I would write about my identity. I would be in campaigns or shoots because of my identity, which at the time I had no problem with. But looking back now, I realized that that is not necessarily what I want to do all the time. You know, us with marginalized identities often forget that we also have skills and we also have passions that we want to do that, you know, aren't necessarily specific to identity. So I think, yeah, representation is important, especially in the media and literary world. Like, you want to engage and educate yourself from literature and work that is from that community, absolutely. But also it's important to know that, you know, if anyone wants to do that in their career, they don't have to. There's sometimes an onus that you should have to push your identity into your work, and if you want to, you can, and if you don't, you shouldn't be forced to or made to be successful.
Yeah, I think that's a really important message, isn't it, for people to be able to have control of, you know, when their identity is the focus and when it's not. And, you know, you mentioned previously, like, that encounter with people who react to your presentation negatively that you hadn't quite expected. And you also don't shy away in the book from statistics relating to mental health and trans people. And you talk about encounters with harassment, assault, and so on, including lack of support from bystanders and from the police, which have made things more difficult for you. So how do you stay true to yourself in the face of these sorts of attacks? And what advice would you give to a non-binary person listening right now who feels scared to express themselves?
Yeah, I think it's not an easy thing to do, I think, to continue being who you are and expressing yourself in the way that you want to look when you do receive such a vast amount of public prejudice. You know, trans people, as I stated in the book, the statistics are harrowing. Trans hate crime is trebling. Like, you know, everything essentially is against us. So in terms of ways in which you can still continue to be who you are, is to remember that everything that is coming at you is not because of you. I think that's something that when I learned that, I really was like, okay, that's really true, because it does feel like you are the problem sometimes. So to know that is, I think, is very important. In terms of advice for people that are worried, I think when I was writing the book and I was writing those sections that are quite listicle and quite advice focused, I found it quite difficult because, you know, one of the main messages of the book is there is no one way to be non-binary. There is no one way to be any gender. So I think to give advice without it sounding a bit wishy-washy is quite difficult. But I'd say tips from my side would be to find chosen family, to find LGBTQ plus people that you can rely on as supposed family, and to have that connection with, whether that be online at the moment, whether that be in your support bubble, or however you can find that. I think that's really important, because when you then do face problems, you aren't facing them alone. And I think just take one day at a time. Something I've learned recently is, you know, is it a problem when you're thinking about your life? Think, is it a problem for today? If it's not a problem for today, it can wait. Just 20. It sounds a bit sad to think that you have to think of your life sometimes 24 hours by 24 hours, but in the world we're in right now, I think that's actually quite helpful advice for everyone, because everybody's struggling.
Yeah, definitely. That sort of one day at a time, deal with what you can today.
Yeah.
And yeah, you do talk a lot in the book about developing your trans family, and how important that is to have those connections and have that trans family for support, and that, yeah, the problems you encounter are other people's problems. It's not you. And that's really important. And I love that in the penultimate chapter of the book you coined the term empathy. And I think that's a lovely way to put it. And you call on cis people to have more empathy with trans people and to be genuine allies, active allyship, as opposed to this kind of performative allyship that we see on social media that isn't actually really practical support or calling out abuse. So who would you say are your top allies right now?
Great question. Yeah, just quickly on the ally thing as well. I was doing some work recently where I was asked to talk about allyship, and I actually declined because I was like, so many times allyship is spoken about as like a title that is adorned upon someone, and I think being an ally is a constant state of actions.
Mhm.
It's not, there's no end goal. It's not like a job position. It's just a state of mind. Now, it sounds a bit corny, but it I think if we stop looking at it as something to achieve and rather just something to be, I think that's more important. I guess my most important allies at the moment are um, my family have grown a lot more since I've written the book. I didn't show them any of the book. They weren't very happy about that, but they read it when it was published, and so they couldn't change things. And after that, we have grown a lot closer. We have a lot more open dialogue between us, which is really great. You know, I live alone. Lockdown's been hard. I have what I would describe as a carousel of people that I FaceTime. Um, it was about 2 people every day. But yeah, right now it's personally for me, it's my family and my close friends. But I think online and in the wider world, it's just anybody that doesn't care about their position, doesn't care about what other people are going to think, and just stands up and supports trans people when they need support, and doesn't do it for any ulterior motive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Standing up without an ulterior motive. And that's great that things are, you know, improved with your family, that they've responded positively to the book. That's really great. So yeah, while we're on the subject of allies, I just wanted to ask you about your awareness of intersectionality, because you make it very clear in the book that you are aware of your white privilege, even whilst being discriminated against as non-binary. And so you make sure to highlight intersectionality. And as most people are probably aware, that if you are a Black trans woman, for instance, then attacks and assaults are even higher than perhaps for white trans people. So can you remember when you first became aware of intersectionality? And can I ask you also about religious oppression in particular? Often when intersectionality is mentioned, people talk about race, class, gender, sometimes also disability, which is really important, but they don't often talk about religion. And yet we've seen a big rise in Islamophobia and so on, but you do also add religion. So perhaps you could say a bit more about your awareness of intersectionality.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, one of the biggest problems within the trans space, one of the many reasons why I realized that I need to change the way that I work, is because faces like mine in the trans spaces, and especially in representation in commercial spaces, are seen as what people like to describe as palatable, and that is just code for white, slim, able-bodied, slightly androgynous. And I think for me, what I found frustrating with that was that the people that I knew in my personal life that were real allies to me and were real friends were intersectional. We had Black and brown trans people of all different walks of life in, you know, that I was with every day. And I noticed that, you know, my position in this space is a privileged one, and I need to acknowledge that. And I think that happened, you know, a long time ago when I first started getting into the industry. I realized, okay, there's a real problem here. And I think the mistake that people fall upon is they acknowledge their privilege and then they stop. And I think now my work with consultancy and my work with I just like being behind the scenes, not in like a big-headed way, but it's just more fun because then I can put people in positions that can show the depth and breadth of the community rather than just the white faces which are commonly shared. Moving on to your point about religion, I think for me, and again looking back at the people that I know, religion plays a big part in their community experience, but also just their experience with family. Like that was my biggest struggle with writing the family chapter, and why I actually really wanted to create the book as and I wanted to include interviews, and I wanted to commission people to write from their perspective, but unfortunately I wasn't allowed. And that was because I understand that family, especially when it comes to religion and gender, is so complex. There is, this kind of generic advice of like, take your time with your family, be kind to them, listen to them, isn't necessarily going to always work in particular situations. And recently, and also in 2019, I did a lot of work with campaigners who look at arranged marriage and honor violence and all those types of things. And I really learned about the ways in which religion impacts gender, not just trans identities, but all gender identities. It's such an important factor that, like you say, doesn't get spoken about a lot of the time when it comes to race, class, age, like ability. But religion is really almost like a silent killer in that respect.
Great, thanks for that, Jamie. Yeah, obviously, I work in religion, that's my field, and yeah, we definitely feel that often in sociology, psychology, lots of other areas, that seems to be the aspect of identity that just doesn't get talked about, and obviously it's so significant for people. That's as much part of their identity as other aspects. So moving on to TEDx. So in 2019, you were asked to give a TEDx London Women's talk, and you speak passionately in that talk about your journey to authenticity and self-appreciation. And if anybody hasn't watched that TEDx talk, they can find that online. But we still have a difficulty with official documents in terms of the full acceptance of non-binary people. And I know that you were campaigning to have non-binary identity recognised on passports. Have you received any positive feedback about any moves in that direction at all?
Yeah, my experience with campaigning in that respect, I can acknowledge now and look back on that was, in the moment, I was happy to do that, and I thought that was a good step. But after the past year, and also just speaking to people that have a much more broader knowledge of things, at that time when I started the petition and the campaign, I was very inexperienced, so I just was very passionate. I think I was just clouded by passion in a way, and naivety, which I can understand. And now I think I can understand the argument for it, and I still think that it can help certain people. But again, it relates back to what we were just saying about the intersectionalities. A lot of these things, for example, with passports and having non-binary passports or non-binary, even like on the census this year, there is a real fear from a lot of people that even just by being able to be identified, your safety is put in danger because you are categorized. Asylum seekers, if asylum seekers have to go through a process where they are labeled as trans, we know from experience that gay asylum seekers and LGBT asylum seekers are harassed in these centers. They are kind of told to prove their sexuality, or all of these really awful things that actually, by providing this option for documentation, could put some people at risk. So that's kind of where I stand on it now. I do know that the campaigner who has been doing it for 20-30 years, called Christy Ellen Caine, Christy has shared that this year it is going back to the Supreme Court. So that I think there will be some news on that this year. But I wish Christy all the best. I've been in touch with Christy, and yeah, I just really enjoyed that experience, because I was like, it was like, for me, it was a clear sign of like natural progression through education and allyship. I was like, here's what I started with. I learned a lot here. I've now changed my mind a bit. That's fine.
Yeah, that's great. That's great to have that awareness of the difficulties. It's not as straightforward as necessarily wanting to have your identity out there, if that actually then is a result of making you more exposed to more abuse. Okay, so and speaking of TEDx, you've just hosted the TEDx London Women with Ben Hurst and Mariam Pasha, and obviously online this time because of COVID-19. But how was it for you?
Yeah, it was really great. We hosted it live from Abbey Road, which is a bit surreal. I was talking to the team at the weekend, and I was like, I still don't really believe that happened, but it was really wonderful. Hosting and presenting for me is something that I've always wanted to do, and I over lockdown and over the start of this year, I've been able to test the waters with it, and I really enjoy it because it's not about identity. It's just about, I can show more personality. I can be a bit cheeky. Like it's just, it was brilliant, and the speakers were brilliant. And for me, TEDx is one of those examples of a team that are family. Like the care and support that they put into their events is astronomical. So yeah, those talks will be out next month online. But yeah, a wonderful experience. Thank you.
Brilliant. And I'm sure there'll be links in your Twitter to those talks, so people will be able to find them that way too. Brilliant. So while we're on the subject of the pandemic, we're now looking at possibly 2 years without Pride parades. What does this mean for the LGBTQ community?
I think last year, one of the biggest things that queer people discuss and say about their identities is that we are more likely and have a stronger ability to adapt. We go through a lot of hardship anyway in our lives. We utilize spaces in ways that are not done before. So I think Pride moving online last year, it did bring its problems. It brought a lot more commercialization. It brought a lot more, and I don't necessarily think commercialization is a bad thing. I just think how it's done needs to be right. If you're going to do it right. And there was a lot of bad campaigns last year that was frustrating to see. I think a big part of queer life is that human connection, is nightlife, it's Pride, it's all of those things, and I think another year without it is going to be difficult. But I think we will be able to adapt again and create something that is a lot more wholesome and brings us together, because I think so many people have just had such difficult times as queer individuals in this pandemic that things still need to go on online. We still need to have that sense of celebration.
It certainly feels like it's been a very difficult year for queer folk, with reforms to Gender Recognition Act going ahead, then this news about puberty blockers and hormones restricted. 350 trans and gender diverse people were murdered globally in 2020. And as I mentioned, with Black trans women being the most at risk. And so we've seen this rolling back of LGBTQ rights in places like Hungary, Russia, and so on. Is the election of Joe Biden something to be excited about against this backdrop?
I think there is there is an argument that a man like Donald Trump, that was actively imposing very trans-specific, anti-trans-specific policies, is something to look forward to. Although, there's something with Joe Biden. I don't necessarily believe the argument of he's the lesser of two evils. I think that's maybe a little bit harsh. He's not amazing, but I think in this position we're in now, he's elected the first trans representative into the Senate. A lot of LGBTQ plus people are moving into his inner circle and into Senate positions that are actually really, we haven't seen that. And part of me, when I saw that, was like, have we not seen that because it's been awful for the past 4 years, or have we not seen that because it's not happened before? And I think it's both. So it is a glimmer of hope. It really is. But I think if you look in Europe, like you said, Hungary, Russia, there's been a lot of legislation that has come in under the radar of the pandemic, that has just been quietly passed, that there's not been able to be uproar about. And I think hopefully we can move in a position as a country that is better and more liberal soon. But unfortunately, I personally can't see that happening for a while, because, you know, Brexit, we've got a Conservative majority, we've got a very kind of meek opposition. Like, I find it's quite despairing sometimes to think what could actually come of this that's good. But we'll see.
Oh, yeah, well, I was going to ask you what your hopes are for 2021, but maybe given what you've just said,
yeah,
you're not very hopeful.
No, I mean, I think I think this is why grassroots groups are so brilliant, is because, you know, change doesn't often come from the establishment. Big change doesn't have to come from legislation change. Big change can come from grassroots organizations, movements, protests. Look at Black Lives Matter. Mm-hmm. That is a great example of that. And I think that is where my hope lies. My hope lies with them, and my hope also lies with the younger generation. They're a lot more switched on than my generation. They're a lot more vocal. Although I don't agree with some of the things that they've done, like if we look at Extinction Rebellion, like they are massively formed from incredibly young climate activists. Black Lives Matter, again, is full of a lot of people who are very young and are very passionate and outspoken and brilliant. And I think that the trans community also has a solid level of younger generational support.
Yeah, some great examples there of young activist movements that have been really effective in bringing about change. So we're starting to get some questions coming in from the audience. So just while people think about what they'd like to ask you, I'll just ask you one more. What does kindness for the LGBT community look like for you in 2021?
I think kindness, is something that I wrote something for Gay Times at the end of 2020 about why, you know, in 2020 as a nation, we saw a lot of kindness. We saw, you know, kindness for our key workers. We saw kindness in that respect for our neighbours, for people who were shielding, and it felt a very kind environment. And I remember when I left my house for one of the first times after the first lockdown, and I just felt very I presumed that I was going to go into a very kind and safe bubble, and I realized, oh, just because we've been talking about kindness for so long, people are actually still being very specific with who they direct their kindness to. And I think this year what we need to do is continue that kindness and look at the reasons why we are kind to people. I read a great book this year called and that's what I forget the name of the book. Right, isn't it? Can't remember, but it was about empathy. And it was looking at the reasons why people are kind is because people have a decision. They just are that they're kind because they think something is moral or they think something is immoral. And this idea of morality is something that everybody can define. You know, some people would think trans people are immoral. Some people would think they are moral. So therefore their kindness, the way they inflict their kindness is dependent on what they decide is moral. And I think we need to stop thinking that certain people are immoral or moral or are not worthy of kindness, because we've all been affected by this pandemic, and we all need a bit of a squeeze when we can.
Coming back to the sympathy that you coin in your book.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. So first question here says, hi Jamie, thank you for sharing your experiences. It's powerful and inspirational. I love your honesty about not writing a children's book. I work in the early years and feel it's important that inclusivity from an early age is key, as often our youngest children are the least prejudiced and naturally curious and inclusive. What would you like to see in education from the early years upwards to support conversation and awareness?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think my reason for not doing it also was because there is actually a growing plethora of literature out there that is geared towards young trans people and young parents and teachers. what I'd like to see is, I think a lot of people who are slightly wary of talking about gender to children think that we're going to come in and, you know, come in with a huge wealth of knowledge and be really intrinsic and physical about it. And I think from what I would want for early years education is to have just a blanket knowledge of what gender is, what gender expression is, and just really kind of begin to dismantle the stereotypes that exist within gender, because they begin at a very young age. And I think if we can get in there early and just say, look, these don't need to exist, they don't do any good, that for me would be ideal.
Great. I think you might have answered the next question as well. The next person asks, I work with organisations who seek to create more inclusive cultures. What would you say the priority should be for those trying to create cultures of psychological safety, inclusivity and belonging? And I guess that's maybe what you've just said about breaking down those conceptions of gender and those barriers to acceptance.
Yeah, definitely. And one thing I'd add to that is, I think a really great way in creating a culture of safety and inclusivity is language. If you can adapt your language, change your language, be respectful of pronouns, just create an environment where language isn't gendered, that for me is a real just indicator that I'm in a safe place. So yeah, definitely.
Great, thank you. Well, the next question is from a non-binary person. So I'm sure they'll appreciate this idea too of breaking down language in that way. This person says, I work online and I was wondering what advice you have for dealing with people misgendering or being abusive online.
I think with online spaces, it's difficult because sometimes you do look for it. Like there are times where I've definitely done things that have received like vast amounts of social media commentary that I've actively gone and looked at, when you can just not look. And that's a lot easier said than done. I think with misgendering, one thing that I've learned is, you know, you don't need to always have to correct people. If you are in the space to correct people, I think, you know, it's important that you try. But you know, pronouns are respect, and if someone is not respecting you and you politely explain to them and it continues, I think it's a travesty in this world, that especially in work scenarios, where if this keeps happening, you know, it is disrespect. It's a breach of kindness and compassion, and especially in a workplace. So you should be able to say something and it be listened to. And I think last year there were protections were put in place for trans and non-binary people in the workplace. So yeah, it's difficult, but I think I just say, just don't think that it's all on you. Try and, you know, speak about it with someone that you're close with, and maybe they can say. That's what I've started doing, is because I really struggle with telling people when they get it wrong. So if I'm with a friend, I'll just say, oh, would you mind just letting them know, and they'll go and have a word.
That's great advice, Jamie. Yeah, you can get other people to stand up for you, stand with you, and be on your side. There's another question from somebody who says they've been misgendered in more public situations, and they feel they're becoming more comfortable explaining gender identity, but also struggle to challenge that sometimes. So that's great that you've dealt with that. Well, answered that for us there. Mm-hmm. There's also a question from a literature colleague. After the success of In Their Shoes, do you have any more writing projects in the works?
Oh, bless you. Yeah, I've started writing the second one, which is going to be good. It's going to be good. No,
it's going to be brilliant.
It's really nice because it's not gender specific. It's not focused on gender. And it's just me writing about something that I love. And I'm formulating the proposal at the moment and writing kind of chapters, and hopefully it will be picked up this year and I can properly get my teeth into it, because I think it's such a nice feeling when you have all the, you know, I's dotted and T's crossed, and you can just crack on and write. So yeah, fingers crossed I will be back with another one.
Brilliant. Well, we shall keep a lookout for that one.
Thank you.
I hope to see that soon. Then there's a question going back to our conversation about religion. Do you feel that LGBTQ people of faith face double prejudice, both from conservative religious thought and from secular thought that sees faith as problematic?
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is where almost those layers of intersectionality and therefore prejudice come into discussion, because like you say, you're going to have people who are, for example, if we look at Islam, we're going to have people who are Islamophobic towards you just because of your religion, and then you're potentially going to have people who are also transphobic coming towards you. And what, intersectionality unfortunately works within prejudice. You could have people from all sides that have lots of different ways in which they are prejudiced, but you're potentially going to get a lot more because of the rhetoric in this country that Islamophobia is wrong or scary or something to be perceived as a threat, especially when trans lives are also seen in a similar vein as something that are confusing or dangerous. So definitely, and I think our services currently don't support people enough who have these intersectionalities with their experience. So that's something I'd want to see change as well.
Yeah, there definitely are, religious groups specifically trying to be inclusive, but that's not always as successful as they would like it to be. And there are communities of religious people who are also trans, but obviously they don't find such a voice in the secular environment where religion is seen as problematic as a whole, often anyway. Then we have a question about the press and media representation of the debate about puberty blockers and the recent ruling in the UK. And the question is just, what do you think about the press representation of this?
Yeah, I think there was a mixed bag. Some, mainly the LGBTQ plus outlets reported on it in a way that was actually correct. A lot of people, I've worked with Sky News before, and they have such sometimes a very bizarre relationship with trans issues, because sometimes they do it very well, and sometimes they don't. And a lot of the reaction to the puberty blockers ruling was that it was, in the least harsh way possible, like it was huge news. And I think, for trans people it was big news, but I think the way that issues like this that affect, trans people are 500,000 people approximately in this country. The fact that it's on a huge scale like that only further delays people who are trying to access those services. I see that it is going back. I don't know the language per se, but it's going back to having a repeal or something, so it can be properly looked at, and the Tavistock Centre can kind of challenge the ruling. But just seeing in the aftermath of that, people's literally the day after, young trans people's puberty blockers medication just being stopped is only fueled by the media representation of these issues. So yeah, it was impactful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So related to that question, I think, do you think younger people should be taught about gender identity in primary as well as secondary school?
I think there's no reason why discussions around gender cannot happen in primary school, because transness doesn't have an age limit. There is no reason why young trans people can't be believed. But I think, again, like what I said earlier, we have conversations about boys and girls. There's no difference with talking about trans people or non-binary people. It's just creating another layer of inclusivity around the language that I think would not be harmful in any way, and would actually create an environment of freedom for younger trans people, especially in primary education, to rid themselves of these stereotypes that they may feel they have to conform to.
Yeah, that would be great, wouldn't it? If we get rid of gendered uniforms and gendered toilets and all of those things.
Yeah.
And then someone asks, how can I start conversations in the workplace in order to create an inclusive environment?
I think the workplace is a difficult one because a lot of times we have conflict of interest. You know, if we work somewhere, there are lots of reasons why we may not bring things up because of our job security, and you know. But I think one thing that I found that I think universities have that a lot of workplaces don't have are like societies or groups. You know, try and encourage more LGBT groups in the workplace. Try and encourage just more conversations around these things, because I think in a work environment, people forget that that is still real life, whether or not your role is public facing or not. You are still a microcosm of society, and you still needs to be aware and educated on these things. So yeah, I think societies and just not being afraid to have these conversations because of fear of losing your job, I think is quite important.
So related to education and opening up those conversations, somebody asks, how important do you think LGBT History Month is in teaching information from the past and creating positive conversations about queer spaces in the future?
I think it's really important because we are in a time now where a lot of queer history isn't spoken about as much as it normally is. You know, we have a lot of time where LGBT people are only spoken about twice a year in February and June. And I think the same people get spoken about. And I think that's fine to a point. You know, you never know if someone's reading that for the first time. But I think LGBT History Month itself, for a lot of young people, just starts the ball rolling. You know, you never, like I say, you never know who's hearing that for the first time. And I think it's continually important that we push this message that we, especially for non-binary and trans people, that we have been here for centuries. We've existed for a long time. There is a rich history to what we do. And not all of it is sad. Not all of it is awful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And highlight those positive stories, as well as the being aware of all the work that still needs to be done to deal with all the negativity. So someone asks, what advice would you have for someone wishing to come out as non-binary? Perhaps the advice is to read the book, but but what other advice?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that advice. But I would say take your time. You know, you don't owe this to anyone. And that's what I really learned, is that you don't actually need, you know, validation is important, but you need to be really special with it because it's something you're telling someone else. It's not, often we think coming out is for the other person, but it's actually, you know, it should primarily be for you. If you feel like you want to do this with this other person or people, go for it. But if your situation could be stressful or you know, it might get, it could be dangerous for you, I think what's really important is to create a safety net for yourself first, of people that you know you can fall back on if coming out does cause you any problem, because it happens a lot. But yeah.
Well, Jamie, it's been fantastic to have you here. A shame we couldn't do this in person, as it were, like on site, but it's great that at least we can still do this in this online forum. So thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you to the audience for listening, for asking these important questions and giving Jamie a chance to expand on these. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you haven't read the book yet, you can buy this from Fox Lane Books, and they have signed copies available for sale. And there is a URL in the chat for you to find Fox Lane Books. Thank you so much, Jamie.
Thank you, Esther.
A fantastic event. Thank you.
It's been a gem. Thank you.
Thanks.